Okay, so pollination syndromes, what are they? Basically, it's a suite of traits, remember, and generally it consists of 6 traits. So the suite of traits is 6 traits. You could think of it sort of like, do you remember the ordination we looked at? You can imagine putting these 6 traits into something like that principal components analysis, and we would get specific clusters of the pollination syndromes. And so those traits are color, nectar, nectar guides, the odor of the plant, the pollen amount and type, and the shape of flower. And so I think most of these you probably know what I mean. Nectar guides, in case you're wondering what those are, you often see these sorts of stripes in plants that help, those are nectar guides. They sort of help insects know where the center of the plant or other types of vectors. And then the nectar that plants make is usually made through nectaries. They produce sort of a sugary, everyone knows what nectar is, but plants have nectaries. And if you remember the plant Chamaecrista fasciculatus that we looked at in lab has actually extra floral nectaries on its leaves, which are probably some other kind of thing. All right, so what I want to go through is a bunch of different names of pollination syndromes, and I do want you to know these names. It's sort of like herbivory. Botanists like to give names to these things because they think they're important, so that if I could talk about anemophily, you would need to know what I meant as a botanist, right? So lots of angiosperms use wind for dispersal, and gymnosperms almost exclusively use wind. So the thing about wind is that it's probably cheap, but it's not very accurate. So what sorts of colors would you expect? This is the kind of discussion we would have if we were in the room together. And I think I'm not going to bother with any discussion here, but you could think, what color would you expect? Well, there's no reason to be any color at all if you're the wind. The wind doesn't care what color you are. And if color comes at a cost, right, you have to produce those pigments, then probably the plants shouldn't produce any pigment at all. So you often get white or greenish flowers. We could think about nectar. Is there any reason to have nectar? No, there's no reason to have nectar. The wind doesn't care if what you taste like. The wind can't see nectar guides. The wind can't smell anything. You're probably going to need lots and lots of small pollen because the wind is so imprecise, right? So you need to just broadcast pollen everywhere. And the flowers are going to be sort of regular net-like structures, these big things that can capture pollen blowing in on the wind. That clap was probably unnecessarily loud. All right, so that's wind pollination. You can also use water pollination. It's a little bit more rare, but some aquatic plants use water to move pollen, and that's called hydrophily. Again, you could imagine that it doesn't matter what color you are. The water doesn't care. There's no nectar guides, no reason to have a smell. You probably need lots and lots of pollen, just like wind pollination, but you might make it so it floats in this cool way. So you can see this example of a plant has the male flowers below the surface and the female flowers floating on the surface, and then they break off little pieces that find their way up to the females. Often male flowers, I think I've got this backwards. Often the female flowers float and the male flowers are submerged. Bees are another common one that I'm sure you're all familiar with. It has this meletophily name. And so one thing to remember is that insect eyes are very different from our eyes. So insects can frequently see ultraviolet light, and humans cannot. And, insects have those crazy compound eyes, so they usually can't discern shape as easily. And bees are also relatively small. So if you think about the colors, right, if you can see ultraviolet, right, and again, normally we would discuss this, but, bright white, yellow, often violet or ultraviolet colors, so colors that we can't actually see. The nectar is usually going to be present, but there's small amounts because bees are little, so you don't need to feed them very much. And also sometimes pollen itself can be the reward. You need nectar guides to help bees find their way to the center of the plant because they can't discern shape very easily. You want a mild but pleasant odor. Bees have very sensitive senses of smell, but they can't smell very far. You're going to want, you don't need as much pollen anymore because you can stick it straight on the bee, and the bee is probably going to go to another flower right away, so you can reduce the amount of pollen you make, again, thinking of costs and benefits, and then often they make sticky pollen so that it sticks to the bee. The flower shape is often smaller, but with some kind of landing pad. There's more variable shapes, like, for example, legume-type flowers still have this landing pad, and then Asteraceae have this huge sort of landing pad where the bee can land and move around. And unfortunately, oh, nope, good. So fly pollination, there's actually two forms. One is called sapromyophily. You do need to know these words, whether or not you can pronounce them. And you could imagine that fly vision is relatively similar to bee vision. But what's different about flies is many of them consume dead or decaying things. And so you could imagine that a fly that's looking for like a dead, decaying animal to lay its eggs in it's going to be hard for a plant to offer, decaying meat reward. But a plant might be able to trick them, right? And so you get these sort of disgusting fly-pollinated flowers. The pawpaw, which is a really common sort of understory tree in Indiana, it actually makes sort of fruits. I think they call them like they're a little bit like a banana. It has fly-pollinated flowers. They'll actually be out soon. If we were on campus, there's a few right around Lilly Hall that you can see. But maybe you know the pawpaw. So you can imagine, what do you do to attract a fly that's looking for dead bodies? Well, you probably want to be colored like decaying meat, so they're usually brown or black. Usually there's no reason to have nectars, right? These flowers are actually trying to trick the flies. Again, no nectar guides, you're tricking the flies. You want a pretty terrible odor. You want to trick the fly into thinking you're not a flower, but that you're a dead animal. You probably want a little bit more pollen, right? The fly is going to come here and probably figure out that you tricked it. So you need a little bit more pollen than if it was a bee, but a little bit less than if it was wind pollinated. Yeah, and then you need a sort of funnel trap shape thing. So the fly kind of comes in expecting to find meat and walks around and then eventually gives up and leaves covered in pollen. So the pawpaw flowers are kind of like wild roses. They're quite big. They stink. So that's one form of fly pollination where you're actually tricking sort of flies that don't really get anything out of the situation. The other kind is myophily. You'll notice that these are sort of similarly named. Sapromyophily, so sapro meaning about decaying. And myophily is just regular flies. So there's lots and lots of kinds of flies. And most flies actually eat nectar or sort of fruit. So, most flies are not the kind of house fly that you're thinking of. They're more like fruit flies. So myophily flowers are actually really similar to bee-pollinated flowers. So I'm not going to go through those again. They can be a little bit smaller often, but they're going to have similar kinds of things. So you can go back and take a look at that. One of my favorite kinds of pollination is bat pollination, or chiropterophily. This is really cool. So bats don't usually see very well. Instead, they use echolocation, right? Or it's a type of sonar to navigate in the dark. And so you could imagine then, what kind of color would you need to attract an animal that can't see very well and doesn't actually use color? Well, you probably don't need any color, right? So you're going to have dull white or green, right? There's no need for color at night. You're going to need lots of nectar because bees or bats are relatively large animals that need a lot of energy to be able to fly. Nectar guides are pretty useless at night. You're going to need a pretty strong odor, but only emitted at night. So that can be a cue if your flower only smells at night. That can be an interesting clue that it might be bat pollinated. You're going to need a lot of pollen. And what's cool, the flower shape now, it needs to be big enough to hold a bat. Big brown bats that are pretty common around here they're only like 50 grams or something like that, but that's still pretty heavy relative to a bee. So you need to be able to hold a bat. They're often kind of bowl-shaped, like a satellite dish, to reflect sound in really useful ways. And they often are closed during the days. And the other thing is bats are somewhat clumsy flyers relative to like a fly or something like that, so you can't have them in obstructed places that are hard to get to. So I think this one is on a cactus, and you can see it's up well away from the cactus where the bat can get to it. So chiropterophily is kind of a cool one. Can also have pollination by birds. That's called ornithophily. And birds have eyes like ours, but birds are pretty heavy. They need a lot of calories, right? Birds also have beaks that allow them to get into places where maybe my face can't get into. And so here is a bunch of bird-pollinated flowers. I think this one's going to be covered by my video, but it's a hummingbird. Right, so the color tends to be bright red or orange, sometimes white, right? So we can see red really well, and so can birds. You're going to need a lot of nectar to feed a bird. They need a lot of energy. You don't really need nectar guides. Birds have good enough vision, and they're sort of smart enough to figure out what to do on their own. Birds don't usually have a really good sense of smell, though. So one way to know if you've got a bird-pollinated flower is that it usually doesn't have that much of an odor. Small amounts of pollen, and then often you need a really large perch support. So this is birds of paradise flowers, I think this is what they call. They make these like literal perches for birds to come in, and they have huge amounts of nectar. If you ever see one of these plants, they're actually like dripping with nectar. And then they often have sort of a funnel for beaks to go in, and you can't see the hummingbird, but you've probably all seen the sorts of flowers that hummingbirds are attracted to. They have these long kind of funnel-like things so that the beak can go in and drink the nectar. Okay, and then we have moth pollination. I'm not even going to try to say that. So moths are actually remarkably similar to hummingbirds. So a lot of them are almost the same size as hummingbirds, and some of them can even hover the way a hummingbird can. Except moths fly at night, and they have vision that's more like a bee or a fly, right? And they have really long tongues, unlike a bird or a bat, right? So you can imagine that they might almost be a hybrid between the bat and a bee or a flower. And indeed, they tend to be pink or white or like a purple kind of ultraviolet color. So we see them as white, but moth would see them as this sort of ultraviolet color, whatever that is. It's going to have lots of deeply hidden nectar because moths have these really long tongues that can get in places where other organisms can't. There's no need for nectar guides at night. They're going to have a sweet, strong odor, again, only emitted at night. They don't need to make very much pollen because they can target it right at the moth. And again, these flowers are often closed during the day. They're often tubular for sort of long, flexible tongues. And then we have butterfly pollination. So there's a lot of names here. You're just going to have to remember them. Psychophily, that's one of my favorite names, right? So again, butterflies are rather like moths, except they can't hover, and they're active during the day. So they have insect vision, right? So again, you're going to have very bright colors, including red more often. Lots of deeply hidden nectar, because again, butterflies have long tongues. You're going to have nectar guides, because these are useful in the day, when there's light out. There's a faint odor. I don't know why the word but is there. Limited amounts of pollen. And again, often closed during the night because you're attracting things that come during the day. And then often sort of have a landing pad because butterflies can't hover. And sort of tubular structures for the long, flexible tongues. And there's lots more kinds of pollination. Right, this isn't a complete list. You can have there's one that's for beetles and it has a name. There's mammals other than bats, and even fish sometimes can be involved in pollination. But I feel like that's a big enough list that I've given you. So one thing that's worth thinking about is vertebrates are so large that it's quite costly for a plant to be vertebrate pollinated. Right, if you think of those birds of paradise flowers, they're huge and they make enormous amounts of nectar. Right, so you could imagine that that's an extremely expensive way to attract a bird to be pollinated. So why would you do that when bees and butterflies and moths are available? Well, there's a couple reasons, maybe, that this might be advantageous in evolutionary terms. Right, birds often travel further. Possibly really long distance dispersal is just worth the cost. Right, remember those terns literally fly all the way around the world every year. Terns don't pollinate. Terns don't pollinate, but you get the idea that a bird can travel quite a big distance. It's possible that some other species is using the invertebrates, right? There's competition for pollinators. And so you could imagine that if some number of species are basically using up all of the invertebrate pollinators, there may be an open niche for a bird-pollinated flower. Another thing that's important to think about is that insects have these passive respiratory systems. They don't actually breathe in and out with lung-like structures. The air just diffuses in through the side of their exoskeleton through, I think they're called sphericals. Whereas vertebrates have very efficient respiratory systems, particularly birds. They can kind of breathe in and out on a continuous loop. And so what that means is that insects actually don't work very well at high elevations because of the low oxygen pressure. And so what you'll see is that you have all these hummingbirds that are on the west coast in the mountains, whereas you have all these moths on in the east. And there's a few hummingbirds obviously around here, but there are many, many more moth species. And so you could imagine that it's possible that it's just cheaper to pay the moths out here than it is to pay a hummingbird, except for occasionally, whereas in the west coast you can't do it. You can't have moths because they can't breathe in the mountains. All right, so let's leave it there, and then we'll talk about fruit dispersal syndromes, which have a bunch of their own names and a bunch of their own characteristics in the next video.